Once our validation is complete, we can check if there are any valid campaigns to create back in our Add PMAX campaigns file. If so, we can move on to our next step, creating an expanded PMAX schema. Here is a look at what I'm calling our expanded schema. Now, this schema is kind of like a hybrid between our flattened schema and the structure of the underlying resources that we'll ultimately be creating. You may notice that our campaign budget, campaign, asset groups, and asset resources all have a resource name field. Each of these will be temporary resource names, meaning they are created using temporary IDs. That's because we'll need to reference each of these resources in other resources within the same request. To that end, you'll see campaign now has a campaign budget field. Each of the asset groups now has a campaign field. Each of the asset group assets have asset and asset group fields. And finally, the asset group signals each have an asset group field. Wow, that was a mouthful. Each of the fields I just mentioned will be populated with the temporary resource name of the corresponding resource. The next change I want to point out is that the resources that were nested in each asset group now more closely resemble the underlying resources we'll be creating. To that end, we no longer have an asset group info field. This will instead be represented by a list of asset group assets. In addition, we now have a list of the assets that will be created as part of our request. Finally, each asset group signal is now represented by a single object rather than a list for each individual type. This schema still isn't an exact representation of the request that we'll ultimately submit. The biggest difference is that we're still nesting assets, asset group signals in each corresponding asset group, despite the fact that these are first-order resources in the Google Ads API. It's helpful to keep these resources nested like this to maintain the order of our operations later on. You could always reorder your operations list later on, but I find it's easier to preserve this order throughout. As a reminder, you can't reference a resource before it's created. And in the context of a bulk mutate request, that means the reference resource must come prior to the referencing resource in the operations list. In addition, you must list all of your asset group asset operations for a given asset group consecutively